I'm Karen Cranston, and I'm at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center in unusually snowy Durham, North Carolina at the moment. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the center of the talk's going to be about the Open Tree of Life project, but putting that within this context of really exciting things that are happening right now in evolutionary biology and broadly in sort of open science, and some of the things that are necessary, I think, to really move this field forward. So just to start, the center that I'm at right now, NSF, is pretty unique. So it's a collaboration between Duke University, North Carolina State University, and the UNC Chapel Hill. And we're a center that focuses on what we call synthetic evolutionary biology. And what that means is we don't fund any research that involves collecting brand new data. So no field work, no lab work. So everything has to do with creating new, larger data sets. Did we lose again? Are we okay?
No, I think you're okay. Yeah, we can still see you.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. For me, it looked strange. So creating new data sets to scale up analyses, to do meta-analysis of examining many existing results, developing new methods. So all of this work really depends on the availability of existing data, the availability of existing methods that we can build upon, developing new software, scaling up existing methods, rather than the collection of new data. The other thing that's kind of unique about NSF is it's very, very interdisciplinary. Okay, let me try this again. I don't know what's happening with slides. Sorry about this, folks.
The test went really well, guys.
The test went great. It was fantastic. Okay. So NSF, very interdisciplinary. So in order to do this kind of really novel research, we need a lot of different skill sets. And one of the big pieces is a transfer of skills and knowledge between people on the computational side and also people on the biology side. And because of that, one of the sort of cool and unique things about NSF, as opposed to a standard university department, is we have this in-house informatics team. So a group of people who have a lot of expertise in programming, in web application development, in data management, building databases, and that team is there available to support the evolutionary biology research community that either is at NSF or visits NSF. So I actually sit right in the middle of this diagram here. I'm on the informatics team, but my background is as an evolutionary biologist, so someone who can sort of speak both of these languages. And these are two themes that I'm going to come back to over and over in this talk, this idea of open science. I'm going to try one more thing because I just lost my slides again. And that is, I'm going to change screens. You'll get a different picture of a pony this time. Yike. Okay, I can no longer see video on the other side. So I'm just going to go forth and hope that someone will ping me if it stops working.
Okay. Yeah, we'll ping you if you don't.
Thanks. Okay, so moving on. Dialogue, computational folks, biological folks, and a small number of people who really sit in the middle of that. So I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, my area of interest is in inferring the tree of life. So this what sounds like a fairly simple question, how are all species, both species living now and species living in the past, related to each other? But this really is one of these grand questions in biology. It's something we've been asking and trying to infer and collecting data and developing methods for literally hundreds of years, sort of even pre-Darwin. And so the asking this question really underlies just a huge amount of how we do biology. So we don't just want the tree of life because it's cool to know how species are related to each other, although that is cool. It provides this framework for how we think about biodiversity and how we analyze biodiversity. So the tree provides a method for organizing species.
Ping.
What is happening? I don't know why we keep losing it. Yay. But okay. I've switched video so I can see it now. So both whether we're organizing species in a database or we're organizing species in a museum collection, we aim to put things together that are related to each other. So evolutionary history plays a huge role in how we organize our biodiversity, but also in any analysis that we do in biology now about how species came to be or why species are the way they are. Almost every question that we ask now for a group of species, the first step is we need a tree. So if we want to ask, this example here is a phylogeny, an evolutionary tree of flies. If we want to ask, how many times did species in this group gain wings or lose wings? We need to do that by having an evolutionary tree. So it's really the sort of baseline of just a huge number of questions that we ask in biology right now. So the project that Jeremy mentioned earlier, and one that I'm going to sort of talk a little bit more in detail about, is called Open Tree of Life. So this is a project that aims for the first time to produce a phylogeny, an evolutionary tree of all species, and one that's available on the web that we can browse, that we can download, that we can ask questions about, and to do so in a way that we can update it when we get new data published. And so OpenTree is really this really amazing attempt to build for the first time the tree of all life. Putting the acknowledgement slide up right here just to really highlight the fact that this is not a solo effort. It's nowhere near a solo effort. This is a huge team. This list here and the accompanying cartoon is just my co-PIs on the project, not the very many postdocs and grad students and undergrads that are all working together. I really want to highlight my team at NSF, which is the technical side, building a lot of the software and keeping the servers running. And this is a project that's funded by NSF. So I'm going to go right back to the sort of a little bit of introduction about what that process actually looks like of building a phylogenetic tree on a sort of simple scale. So we take data that we have, and increasingly, most commonly now, that's sequence data. So DNA, RNA, protein sequence data. We combine that with a model of evolution. So a model that tells us, how does this DNA sequence, how do we think it changes over time? And then we find the tree that best matches that data to that model. And each of these pieces is a huge field of research unto its own. So for example, data is getting, as I'm sure you all know, increasingly large, with these new next-gen sequencing techniques, we can generate terabytes of data in very little time and with surprisingly little money. And we need methods to deal with this sort of onslaught of genetic data. How do we assemble the really raw data that comes off these NGS machines? How do we filter the enormous amount of data to some that we can actually handle in our analyses? How do we just manage that much data? How do we visualize it? And efficiency is becoming increasingly important. We need programming implementations that can sort of scale over this size of data. Evolution's a really complex process. We have models of evolution that really go in a huge range of complexity. As we get more data, we can get more complicated. That drives more complicated models because we have more power in our analyses. So there's this constant push to develop models of evolution that more accurately represent what we know about biology. And this is a sort of constant feedback: more data, better methods, more methods, we need more data, and they really go hand in hand. And then finally, there's the question of, once we have data on a model, we need to sort of find the best tree, which in itself is an extremely hard problem. So for even a small number of species, 10, the number of possible ways they might be related is greater than the number of atoms in the universe. You know, in the largest data sets that we have so far, we're looking at the order of tens of thousands of species. So these really beg for new algorithms that can efficiently search tree space in order to find that best tree. So it's really a combination. What I've described here is, you know, a research area that requires biology, people who know how to collect animals and other biodiversity, how to sequence them, how to manage that data, mathematicians to develop new models, computer scientists to develop new algorithms. And each of these sort of three pieces increasingly needs all of these different skill sets. So every year, we're really actually quite good at that pipeline that I just described. We have many, you know, really good models of evolution. We're generating more and more data all the time, and we publish tens of thousands of phylogenies every year. We've got about, you know, 200,000 species in GenBank that have sequence data. That's a pretty small fraction of the number of named species that we have in other databases. And that itself is only a fraction of the millions more that remain sort of unnamed or undiscovered. And this is the part of biodiversity that's really exciting right now. You may have heard of metagenomics, where we go and we sample in the environment and find species we've never been able to culture in the lab, or we can't easily just catch in a trap. So the scale of this problem, this inferring the tree of life and combining all of this data, is really, really immense. So what OpenTree is trying to do is not infer new phylogenies from sequence data, because we do that as a community really well already. What we're trying to do is say, no one is taking all of these evolutionary trees, this like fire hose of evolutionary data, and trying to summarize and tell us, what do we know right now about the tree of life, and what do we not know about the tree of life? So the first big challenge that the project faced was really, how do we efficiently summarize our current phylogenetic knowledge? So there's two kind of inputs into our overall pipeline, and the first is phylogenetic trees. So that's, you know, phylogeny defined as taking data, whether that's sequence data or morphological data, doing some sort of, you know, putting it in a computer program, doing some sort of inference method, and then out the other end getting a phylogenetic estimate. So phylogenies tend to be highly resolved, which means we get lots of detail about how species are related to each other. Again, they're computationally derived, but they have limited coverage in terms of all biodiversity, just because we have sequenced we have sequence data and morphological data for so few of the species that we know exist. So we need to supplement, if we want a tree that's complete, we need to supplement that phylogenetic data with something else. And that something else is what we call taxonomic data. So this is the sort of hierarchical organization of species into these sort of ranked classes. So kingdoms organized into phylum, organized into classes, orders, families, genera. So building taxonomies is much more of a process of manual curation, going through the literature, making decisions about what thing should go in what class. And each of these sort of types of ranked taxa, it's really a bucket. There are only a limited number of ranks. And so if we were to draw that in the same sort of structure that we draw our trees, what you get are what we would call a polytomy. So you see these sort of nodes with just lots of descendants with very little structure. So taxonomies are much more complete. They tend to contain more species than phylogenies, but they're not nearly as well resolved. And they're often, they're not explicitly evolutionary in the way that phylogeny is. So those are our two kinds of inputs. So what we're doing with OpenTree is taking published phylogenetic data and combining that with taxonomic data where we have gaps to produce this overall tree of life. And the idea is, as we update taxonomies, or as the community updates taxonomies, as the community publishes additional phylogenetic trees, we wanted to build a process by which we could continually update this tree of life so it could stay current with current thinking, so that it wasn't a static thing that we published once in a paper, but something that sort of was living and was being constantly updated. So just a sort of schematic of what that sort of looks like or how that works, and leading into how we dealt with that challenge. So in this case, we have two phylogenies. We have one butterflies, and we have one with pitcher plants. And they don't overlap at all. There aren't any butterfly species that are in the plant tree, and there aren't any plants that are in the butterfly tree. So without other data, we have no way to know really how we might connect these. And they're not very big trees. They don't have very many species. So we use taxonomies to add sort of the missing branches. So we add the branches that connect trees that don't have overlapping species. And then we can add species richness at the tips from our taxonomies. So we get the structure of the phylogenies inferred from data, that evolutionary structure, but we get completeness from taxonomic data. So doing this over thousands of input trees and dozens of input taxonomies, it was really unclear when actually we wrote the grant for this project how we were going to do that. And it's a relatively novel technology that's enabled us to be successful at this and develop something that's scalable. And that new technology is something called a graph database. So I don't know if any of you have experience with databases, but most more traditional databases, your data is organized in a similar way that you would organize data in a spreadsheet. You have rows and you have columns. Everything's tabular, and you can have tables that share data or link to each other. So that's a relational database. Graph databases are a completely different kind of structure. So instead of the data being in rows and columns, the pieces are nodes and edges. So we have nodes that are entities. In this case, this example here, they're people. And then we have edges, which are the relationships between people. And the specific technology we're using is something called Neo4j, which is an open source graph database. And they're increasingly widely used for sort of network data. So some of you may have seen images that look like this. This happens to be a graph of internet or Twitter connections at an open source conference. And so this is the kind of data that graph databases are very, that handle sort of very, very well. We've got nodes, in this case, they're Twitter users, and we've got edges, which in this case are mentions or retweets between users at a conference. So if we think about phylogenies, evolutionary trees, they're really collections of nodes and edges. They're taxa, which are connected by branches. So it's a very natural way to store a collection of trees in a database. So we can take our phylogenetic tree, we can create nodes in the graph database for all of the taxa and create edges where those taxa are connected, the sort of hypotheses about evolution. So the image in the top here is a single tree, and then the image in the bottom shows we can add a second tree, in this case, blue branches, that contain the same 4 tips, the same 4 species, but different hypotheses about how they're related. So that we can reuse nodes in the graph where we have overlap between trees, and we can create new edges where we have conflict between trees. So this is a way to naturally handle the kind of conflict that we see in phylogenetic analysis. Not every data set agrees about how species are related. And this allows us to handle that in a very easy way and store all of that conflict. So we can continue to add additional trees to this graph database and get something that becomes increasingly messy. And what we're doing right now is exploring ways to traverse that graph, i.e. follow edges in order to bring out a single tree, for example, by preferring a certain kind of edge over another. So we always prefer edges that come from phylogenetic trees over edges that come from taxonomy. We could prefer edges that come from trees published more recently, or edges from trees inferred with a certain kind of data or a certain kind of method. So this framework allows us to ask all kinds of interesting questions about how trees agree or don't agree with each other, but also allows us to pull out this single structure as a summary. So I said that the graph does get pretty messy. So this is a visualization of, and this actually is from about a year ago, the entire graph database with all of the trees and taxonomies, and we refer to this as the hairball of life. So it's really, this new technology really lets us store this incredible amount of conflict, and yet, deal with that quite easily. This thing that we thought was going to be a huge challenge of combining all of these thousands of different inputs with all of this conflict, and how are we going to do that? Along comes this new technology, these graph databases that very naturally handle exactly the kind of data that we have. So we have now, we're on our 3rd draft of a complete tree of life. We have a user interface where you can browse that tree. And for any branch in the tree, you can get information about what inputs support that. So which particular phylogenies support a given edge in the tree. So anything, and we can represent solid lines for phylogenetic inputs and dotted lines where we only have taxonomic data. So this current iteration has 2.3 million tips or species. There are 483 inputs phylogenies in the current version and 7 input taxonomies. And of those 2.3 million tips, only a pretty small number, about 46,000 of them actually come from phylogenetic trees as opposed to coming from phylogeny. So there's really, I think a couple, well, one, and I think there actually is several, big questions about what comes next. The first thing you might ask is, why is that visualization so ugly? And we agree that it is. And I just want to highlight that visualizing large phylogenies is a huge challenge in this field, and one that there's been an enormous amount of work and very few satisfying solutions. So we were never funded to do fantastic visualizations, but that's certainly an area that we need. We need people to start thinking about that, and people who can do the web programming to make those interactive visualizations. So the other big question here, or big obvious question to me at least, is why are there only 500 input trees and 50,000 tips? If we're publishing tens of thousands of phylogenies a year, why does this draft now contain so little data? And that actually leads us to sort of the second big challenge of this project, is what happened to all of the other trees? And this is actually not a technical issue. This here is actually a social issue, or mostly a social issue. So when I talk about we publish 10,000 trees a year, we publish an article in a journal, and somewhere in that article, if we download it as a PDF, there will be at least one image of a tree. And this is an example from a colleague of mine, Brian Wegman. We saw this tree earlier in the talk. And this is a big tree of flies. So in this article, there is a lovely image of a tree. Most of the phylogenies that we publish every year, the only way that we can get the tree is that image. And I've just spent the last 10 minutes talking about graph databases. An image is not something that we can put into a graph database. What we want is an actual data file that contains the tree. So this is in the corner here, one representation, one way that we represent trees. So that we can put into a database. An image we can't. So there are databases that take published phylogenetic trees. There's a database called Dryad, which I'll talk a little bit more later. There's one that's specialized for phylogenies called Treebase. And so there are some fraction of phylogeny publications that put something that looks like this into the database. At the same time, they will create a very beautiful image, usually that goes into the paper. And I mean, if we look at this image, we can just immediately see that it's decorated with all sorts of other useful information. We've got images, we have clade names, we have well-labeled taxa, we have other annotations on the tree that tell us when specific things evolved. None of that information is making it back into these databases. So even in cases where someone does publish data, we're very rarely getting all of the metadata that's in an article. So what we would like to be able to summarize with Open Tree of Life is our phylogenetic knowledge. So that's the tens of thousands of phylogenies we publish every year. There's been a couple studies recently that have tried to estimate or that have estimated how many of those trees make it into databases, and it's about 4%. So it's almost none of them. We did a huge campaign of emailing authors and asking, can we please have your tree file? That bumped us up to about 16% from 4%. But even that is really not very high. Most authors either ignored the email or said that they didn't want to share their data, or said that they couldn't share the data because it was on a collaborator's computer and they didn't know where that was, or it was on their previous computer and the hard drive died, or that data was just lost. If you wanted to put that tree in a database, you'd have to redo the entire study to regenerate that file. And this is, so you might say, well, we need to have better regulations about putting trees in databases. And there actually are quite a few regulations. The National Science Foundation now has guidelines about publishing data along with your grant. Many journals that publish phylogenetic trees actually have a mandate that says you must publish your data. But despite these, very few people do. So these things that we call sticks, the rules and regulations, are really not enough to motivate people to share data. People forget, they don't want to, editors forget to check, reviewers forget to check, and data just gets lost. So one of the things, kind of cool things we're doing with OpenTree is to try and figure out what can we do to make people want to share their phylogenetic data. So now at OpenTree of Life, we've got all of these phylogenies and all of these taxonomies, and we've got this big summary of the tree. And there are cool things that somebody who had their own tree can do if they were to upload their tree into the system. So you can ask, how does it compare to other trees? So when we publish a new tree, we inevitably have to write a paragraph that says, this is how my tree compares to previous trees that have been published. And so using the OpenTree of Life data, you can upload a tree and we can tell you, or at least we're getting close to being able to tell you, how does this compare with other published estimates for these species? Someone who comes and looks at our tree and says, like, it's terrible. I can't believe that you don't have, the relationship that I proposed. There's a button that allows you to upload your data and actually improve the tree, which then can turn around and get you citations for people who are going to use the OpenTree of Life and use the part that is informed by your phylogeny. Or asking the question, I have a tree for these species, show me some other trees that have, some or all of these species. So we're trying to, we still do rely somewhat on sticks for data sharing, but trying to think more about what the carrots are, what can we do to make people want to share data, to make it useful for people to share data beyond just sort of a chore that they have to do to satisfy some requirement. So the part of what I'm alluding to here and what the open in OpenTree of Life means is really this idea of open science, that recognizing that science is all about building on the results of previous people and previous research groups. And increasingly now our science is based on computational analyses and large data sets, and that we should be sharing those results. We should be publishing our source code for our software when we write new software, both so that other people can take that and build on it, but so other people can actually see if our software does what we think it does, in order to reproduce results or replicate results. And we should publish data sets so that we, again, can replicate results. We can have confidence in published results because we can see the data and we can see the software. And it allows for people to do the type of synthetic research we do at NSF or to do meta-analysis. And then the third tier of that open science, the open source software, open data, is open access, which is publishing our papers in journals such that you don't have to pay to read them. So that makes them available to colleagues at institutions that don't have journal subscriptions, to the media who want to report on scientific articles, to the general public, to teachers who want to read the scientific literature. So, open science is a principle that this project is really trying to follow, even to the extent of making all of our email communication and notes from meetings public, so that people can really see what's happening in the project and replicate results and build on what we're doing. So all of our software is open source. You can look at the source code for any of it. It's available on a site called GitHub, which allows for collaborative software development. And if you look up here at the sort of number of people that are involved with OpenTree software development, it's much larger than the number of people who are actually funded to work on the project. And that's really cool. This is, a community of people that is beyond the original grant who are working on the software for this now community project. We're trying to make our data as open as possible. So in addition to putting our source code on GitHub, we're actually putting our data on GitHub as well. And that means that it's really easy to go and download all of the Open Tree of Life data. You don't have to ask for permission to do so. It's just public. You can go search it. You can download the whole thing. It also allows people to contribute. GitHub has collaborative elements that work for collaborating on code that work equally well for many kinds of data. So this would allow somebody else to build a different type of interface on top of the entire Open Tree of Life data store. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it's a way to really move this field forward, is to make all of this as open and accessible as possible. So I mentioned NSF-funded earlier. These, principles of open science go well beyond the Open Tree of Life project. NSF-funded has been a long supporter of this way of working, and has had a policy for people sponsored by NSF-funded to make their data and their software available to the broader community. And this is really a recognition that the type of science that we do at NSF-funded, because we don't collect new data, is only possible when we can reuse other people's data and previously published results. So it behooves us to act in the same way. And the NSF-funded policy predates many of the policies at journals and even at the National Science Foundation. I mentioned that there were a couple of specialized databases, or there was a specialized database for phylogenetic trees. There's a specialized database called GenBank for sequence data. There's a specialized database called the Protein Database for protein sequence data. But we couldn't possibly have a specialized database for every kind of data that scientists produce. And so another project that's really been incubated at NSF-funded is the Dryad data repository. So what Dryad does is accept any kind of data that's affiliated with a scientific publication. It puts it into a permanent archive. It provides it a DOI, or a digital object identifier, that allows you to track who uses that data and cites that data. So for authors, this gives you a place to make sure your data is permanently archived, but it also gives you a way to track this as a separate product, separate from your published article. Not just who's reading my article and who's citing sort of the results and the ideas in there, but who's reusing this data set. And those are increasingly valuable contributions, and I think it's important that we track those and give credit to them. So I've talked a lot about the sort of dependence of Open Tree of Life and similar kinds of projects on the idea of sharing data and sharing software, sharing scientific results. But as important to that is just the reliance of Open Tree, of NSF-funded, on interdisciplinary research. So there's not just a single type of biologist on this project, nor are there only biologists on this project. We have evolutionary biologists, systematists, theoretical folks, computational biologists, computer scientists, mathematicians, web developers who write all of the software. We have a journalist PI who's been doing a lot of the educational graphics and outreach on social media. So we're dependent on having people, both individuals with all these unique skill sets, but also people that have combinations of these skill sets in order to be successful. And so there's sort of a question of how do you, as a biologist, how do you gain those skills? I mean, often the type of computational skills that we might want aren't offered in a university program or university course or they might be offered, but they don't fit in your schedule. You don't really need to take maybe you don't need to take an entire algorithm course from computer science. You just want to get a little bit of basics for how to branch out of your domain. So I'm going to talk about a few kind of projects that I've been involved with about trying to teach kind of interdisciplinarity, particularly the technical skills for biologists. So the first one of those is a pair of sister projects called Software Carpentry and Data Carpentry that teach 2-day boot camps for scientists with the aim to just make them more efficient as scientists. So these are what we say zero entry. They don't require any background knowledge. They start assuming that you know nothing about these sorts of techniques. So showing you how to more efficiently manage data on your machine, how to automate processes that you do frequently, how to become comfortable with the basics of scripting and analysis, scripting generation of figures and graphs, managing data, getting out of Excel and getting into databases and other sort of more scalable workflows. So we've taught these workshops, hundreds of them, all over the world over many, many years. Software Carpentry recently taught its 10,000th learner in January. So this has been a really successful project. And it's a nice way to sort of get over that initial kind of activation energy to figure out, how do I even start? How do I go from using Excel to being able to use R, Python to do data analysis? A sort of more intense project or more intense learning is something called the Google Summer of Code. So the way this project works is open source software companies or projects, not all companies, apply to Google to be part of the program. Those that are accepted then recruit students and mentor them to write code over the summer, and you get a stipend from Google at the end. And there's lots of scientific projects that have been involved with Google Summer of Code. So NSF was an organization for 7 years, and we had about 50 students go through. And there's projects for every kind of programming language and projects for every skill set. So people who are just starting out and don't know anything about writing code to people who are expert coders. So it's a really fun way to both learn a lot over a summer, but also become part of an open source community and learn how to contribute to that kind of community. And then the third type of event that I've been involved with that furthers these same kind of ideas are a series of hackathons. So this is where people get together for, in our case, it's usually a week or 5 days, to get away from their regular day jobs and to write code. So the general way these work is there's a call for participation, you apply. We usually try, or we always try and get a diverse group of people in the room. So we don't want all, white men in the room. We also don't want all superstar coders who are not going to have any idea what users actually want to do with their projects. So having a diversity of people, having a diversity of experiences. So we gather this group into a room, and on the first day, we pitch ideas. I think I want to work on this for the week. People self-assemble into groups, into teams, and you spend the rest of the week writing code. So again, this is that combination of, building something, learning skills, and becoming part of a community of people that then go on to continue to collaborate after an event like this. So we've done several of them at NSF. This is just a partial list. So we've done hackathons that have developed standards for sharing phylogenetic data. So answering that question of, if you're going to put your tree in a database, what kind of file should it be and what kind of information should be in that file? And do we have computer programs that can read those and write those? Hackathons in genomics for visualizing and annotating genomic data. And then a couple recently that have been focused specifically on phylogenies, both the question of, I have a list of species, how do I get a tree for these species? And then most recently with Open Tree of Life, we did a hackathon where we asked people, we said, this is the data that we have, and these are the services that we have. What do you want to do with this? So we brought people in that wrote software libraries to access the data and search the data and parse the data. People built software packages that did analyses by combining Open Tree of Life data with data from other databases. And that was one of the things that led to this large community of people contributing code to the project. So we really not only got some useful products, but we built this like great community of people who all now know a lot more about the software and the data and are excited about, continuing on and collaborating. So just in summary, the tree of life and inferring the tree of life, while it seems like a pretty simple idea, we want to know how species are related, is really a huge, huge question in biology. And there's tons of open questions in how we generate sequence data, how we develop new models, how we develop new algorithms, how we visualize, whether it's sequence data or models or large trees at the other end. And this requires collaboration from people with a huge diversity of skill sets. So biologists who understand the organisms and know what the biological hypotheses are or what questions they want to ask. Bioinformaticians, computer science, math, increasingly data scientists and web developers, people who can actually write software to do analyses, who can write software to put things up on the web. And there's lots of existing projects and programs that are out there to help develop interdisciplinary skills. So programs for scientists to get some background and some skills in coding, which both can bring you into a really interesting community and lead you down interesting paths, but also can just make you a lot more efficient at the science that you're doing already, allow you to scale up your analyses, to ask bigger questions, to do bigger things. And I'll point out too, I've given you all of this in the context of the Tree of Life because that's what I'm passionate about and what my background is. But this applies to all kinds of areas of both biology and to science in general. There's a need for us to be more open with our software and our data to be able to build on previous products. And there's a huge need for people who have interdisciplinary skills. And so I hope I've made you at least a little bit excited about that and given you some things to think about sort of where you go next in your career. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. We have some time for questions. If you have a question, we record these talks and we archive them on YouTube. So we like to record questions and answers as well. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll run a mic to you so you can ask it. I'll kick things off with one of my own because it's on this slide. So you talk about data scientists, and I see that term used a lot in sort of like lists of the hottest jobs for the next year or something like that. So what is a data scientist and how do they sort of relate to this team of people?
So it's really, I think we're getting echo. No, I think we're okay. So it's people who have skill in managing, analyzing, visualizing, especially large data sets. So you're seeing it come up in government jobs, in industry jobs, in scientific jobs. I think it's a field kind of like when bioinformatics first showed up, that people are still trying to figure out what that means. But there's just a huge need in lots of industries for people who can sort of make sense of large data sets. And that includes, the analysis part. So there's a huge statistical element to that, as well as often a big programming element.
It's sort of a combination of computer science and math focused on big data sets, something like that.
Yeah, in some ways it's a combination of programming and statistics. You know, how do you, you know, someone gives you a hard drive with terabytes of data. How do you know how do you organize that? How do you find things? How do you do analyses that are scalable and efficient? You know, data mining, finding patterns in large data sets. Yeah.
Great.
Hi, Karen. So I have a question about if only 4% of the data is going to Dryad and Treebase, can someone mine GenBank for everything with 16s and everything with Site B and make a tree and then throw that into the Tree of Life or the Open Tree of Life, or is it more you need sections submitted independently? Does that make sense?
So right, yeah. So and that's a good question. We have tried not to do that ourselves, just because, like we said, that people are doing a really good job at building trees. We didn't feel we needed to replicate that effort. So we're trying to just convince more people to share the data that we already have. There's, you know, obviously we've got about 50,000 tips. There's about 200,000 taxa and GenBank. So there's still enormous potential there for people to do analyses with the sequence data that already exists in GenBank. Then there's just questions about, I mean, ongoing questions in this field where do you get a better tree if you get all the 16S sequences and build a giant tree, or are you better to do more focused, you know, small analyses with richer evolutionary models on a smaller number of species? And I think that both kinds of data are useful for both. I mean, I say us, I don't really mean just OpenTree, but having input trees that have been built with lots of different kinds of models allow us to ask interesting questions, right? What kind of conflict do we see for species built with method X versus method Y?
Hi, Karen. If you could explain sort of to everybody in the audience how you ended up with this position. So when you were in graduate school and you were an undergrad, what sort of classes did you take and how did that turn into the position that you have now?
Sure. So when I started undergrad, there weren't bioinformatics programs or computational biology programs. You really had to make a decision: were you going to do biology, were you going to do computer science? And I really liked both of those. And I made the decision that I was, you know, the thing I was really passionate about was biology. And I did an undergrad degree in genetics. And then I actually worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a few years after that, because I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do for grad school. And this was right at the time that the informatics and computational biology were really becoming big. So then I decided I wanted to go back and do something that was entirely computational. I'd also by that point convinced myself that I was terrible at lab work. And I should not continue anything like that as a career. So I did a PhD that was statistical genetics in, you know, methods for inferring phylogenies. And I had done some coding before this, but that's where I really sort of self-taught myself, you know, programming. And then I've been computational ever since. I did a postdoc with Mike Sanderson, sort of building big databases and pipelines to assemble trees from all of GenBank. And then I got increasingly interested in the informatics side. So interested in things like data standards and databases and how do we share data. And so I worked for a while in one of the subgroups for the Encyclopedia of Life. And then this job at NSF came up and it seemed like a really perfect opportunity. So I'm not in a tenure track position. I am a staff in the informatics group at NSF, and I'm lucky enough to be able to maintain a research my own research program in addition to that. But I mean, so I love that combination of the biology and the informatics, and I can say that there have been no shortage of career opportunities for people with this kind of skill set.
Any other questions? I have one last one. So the open tree. So one of the great things about having it open is that anybody can interact with it, including students or the public or things like people like that, people who aren't professional evolutionary biologists. Is it sort of ready for that, or how do you see sort of the public or students interacting with open tree in the future?
So that's a good question, and everything has been open and public right from the beginning, but it hasn't been. We're right now, we have a paper, we have, the big paper is in review right now, and we're just about to do a sort of public release. And the sort of journalist PI that I'd mentioned early on has put together like a whole educational site that's sort of educational / public site that's much more friendly to people who don't have background in phylogenetics. And then that interface that I showed you partway through the through the talk is really the one that's aimed at the scientific audience. We would love to have somebody really take a stab at a great visualization. That was never part of the original project, just to sort of maintain a reasonable scope. But that's really an area that needs a lot of work, is how do we visualize both just a giant tree, but also how do we visualize all that conflict that's there? How do we show, okay, I'm showing you this tree, but here's all of the other trees that agree and other trees that don't agree. And so that's a huge area. So there will be a real, like a public friendly, kind of non-expert friendly website that should be online within the next week or so. And then the one that's there is really aimed at a more scientific audience. But I'd love to have something that combined both.
Yeah, that's a tough balance to strike, I would imagine. Anybody else? Okay, before we thank Karen one last time, I just want to let you know there's food and such out in the lobby, so please stick around, hang out. If you haven't signed in already, we like to keep track of how many people come and who comes, so if you could sign in, that would be great. And please join me in thanking Karen one more time. There was a lot of
Thank you,
clapping.
Jeremy.
I don't know if you could hear that, but.
Yeah, I heard it. Well, thank you all, and I'm sad that I can't have snacks with you now.
It's canes too.
Yeah, we have canes for those of you who are non-vegetarian, and pizza for those of you who are vegetarian. So.
Karen, thanks for bearing with us with the technical difficulties.
Yeah, that was nice, despite the difficulties at the beginning.
Thank you.
Yeah, we figured it out. Cool. Okay. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks so much.